He came to Africa to bury his wife, but found himself surrounded by 6 lions instead. No rifle, no backup, just a soaked old man cradling their missing cub. And what those lions did next, it defied every law of nature and every instinct for survival. This isn't a tale about predators and prey. It's about a second chance for a man, a pride, and the very way we understand the wild. They say Africa never truly leaves a man's soul. For Frank Delaney, that was more than a saying. It was a truth carved into the lines of his weathered face and the weary bones that carried him back across the world. At 66, Frank was not the kind of man who made bucket lists or meditated on mountaintops. No, he was an old ranger, a man who had once walked a wild bush with a rifle in one hand and moral conflict in the other. A man who'd lived through heat stroke, snake bites, and unspeakable choices. And for 38 years, he carried one of those choices like a stone in his gut. The day he let young lion die because policy told him to. It haunted him. It haunted him like the image of his wife Eleanor's eyes as she took her last breath 6 months ago. Cancer had taken her faster than a drought takes the green from the grass. Her last request wasn't for Frank to stop mourning or to move on. It was this: take me back to Kenya, where we met, where we loved. Let the wind scatter me where the lions roar. So here he was. Frank stood at the edge of the Olare Ora Conservancy, clutching a weathered wooden urn in one hand and an ache in his chest that no aspirin could touch. His boots sank slightly into the ochre soil, the same land he'd once patrolled as a younger man, back when he believed nature had rules and men had answers. The sky above was a harsh, cloudless blue, and the wind carried that dry, ancient smell of dust, bark, and distant danger. He didn't come back for closure. He came back because something inside him knew he owed a debt, not to any one creature, but to the wild itself. And today, that debt was about to come due in a way he never imagined. He was walking alone, the only sound the steady crunch of gravel beneath his boots and the slow ticking of his breath. In the distance, he could hear elephants trumpeting, the whooping of hyenas, and the low rumble of a thunderstorm building beyond the escarpment. But it was another sound that stopped him cold, high-pitched, repetitive, desperate, not human, but familiar. Frank turned, scanning the tree line near the Olare River, his instincts kicking in like they used to when every second meant the difference between life and death. He moved toward the noise with a limp, his left knee still stiff from a hip replacement, but determination burned hotter than any pain. Then he saw it. A tiny lion cub no older than 4 months, half dangling from a broken patch of earth along the riverbank, its claws slipping on wet mud, its small body being dragged down by the unrelenting pull of the swollen water. Frank's heart stopped. No, not this time. He growled under his breath. The memory came back in a rush. A similar cub, years ago, caught in a poacher's snare. Headquarters told him to leave it. Let nature take its course, they said. Don't interfere. It sets a precedent. Frank had obeyed then. He'd stood by as the cub screamed. And when it went quiet, something in him had died too. But not this time. He dropped the urn gently beneath a fever tree, pulled off his boots, and stepped into the frigid water without hesitation. The current bit his legs like snapping jaws, and the river was deeper than he remembered, deceptively fast, churning with silt and hidden dangers. Each step was a war against gravity and time. The cub let out another cry, and Frank surged forward chest deep now, arms extended. "Hang on, little fella," he shouted, not knowing if it was for the cub's benefit or his own. He reached the cub just as it lost its grip and slid fully into the river. With a swift lunge, he grabbed the soaking ball of fur by the scruff and yanked it against his chest. The cub clung to him with its tiny claws, burying its face into the crook of his neck, whimpering like a frightened child. But the fight wasn't over till a submerged branch caught Frank's shin, nearly knocking him off balance. He winced, stumbled, but didn't let go. He turned with the current, letting it assist his exit. His muscles screamed. His ribs ached. But step by step, inch by inch, he dragged himself and the cub toward the shore, each moment a battle against forces greater than himself. Then the growl. Low, menacing, close. Frank's eyes shot upward and his breath caught. They were there. 5 lionesses and one massive, Scarred male had materialized from the bush like ghosts with teeth. They stood utterly still, eyes locked on him. No snarling, no pacing, just watching, judging. Frank froze in waist-deep water. The cub still clutched to his chest. Every nerve screamed. He was unarmed, vulnerable, surrounded, and he held what was possibly their youngest member in his arms like a stolen heirloom. It was a standoff of biblical weight. He didn't dare speak. He didn't dare blink. The wind stilled. The air thickened. The matriarch stepped forward. She was older than the rest. Her fur faded around the eyes, but there was no weakness in her. Only wisdom, authority, and something else Frank didn't expect. Recognition. Her golden eyes scanned him, not like a predator sizing a prey, but like a mother measuring a stranger's intentions. Her eyes locked onto his, then flicked to the cub, then back again. Frank wanted to say something, to explain, but what words could make sense here? This wasn't human territory anymore. This was a place of primal rules, ancient understandings. So, he did the only thing that made sense. He dropped to one knee in the river, still holding the cub, and gently placed it on the grassy shore. Then he slowly raised both hands in the air, palms open, vulnerable, honest. "I'm just making it right," he whispered, barely audible. "That's all." What happened next would be told and retold in dusty safari lodges, in research papers, on late-night news segments, and eventually in every wildlife documentary from Nat Geo to BBC Earth. But none of them would capture the truth of that moment the way Frank felt it. The lioness stepped forward, not with aggression, but grace. She didn't growl. She didn't threaten. She leaned down and nuzzled her cub. The little one let out a soft mew, and the tension broke like a shattered dam. But she didn't stop there. She turned back to Frank and pressed her forehead gently to his shoulder. It wasn't dominance. It wasn't curiosity. It was acknowledgement, gratitude, the kind that passes between warriors after battle, the kind that exists beyond language. Frank wept. He couldn't help it. Not after all these years. Not after all the guilt, the pain, the what-ifs. In that single gesture, the wild forgave him. And in that forgiveness, he found something he thought he'd lost. Peace. The rest of the pride slowly moved in, flanking their matriarch. But there was no hostility in their eyes. Only awareness. They understood, in some way that science still can't fully explain, that this man had risked everything to do what was right. Frank stood slowly, unsure what to expect next. Would they retreat with their cub? Would they vanish into savannah like ghosts of memory? No, they stayed. And that was when he noticed something even more miraculous. The scarred old male, the one with half an ear missing and eyes like molten gold, stepped forward and laid down at Frank's feet. An apex predator showing submission not to weakness, but to honor. This wasn't nature. This was something older. Older than teeth. Older than violence. This was respect. Frank would later describe that day in his journal like this: "I went to Africa to bury my wife, but the bush buried my guilt instead." For a long moment, Frank didn't move. He knelt at the river's edge, soaked and shaking, not just from the frigid waters of the Olare, but from the weight of what had just unfolded. He had come to scatter the ashes of the woman who'd made him whole, and instead found himself caught in a living myth, surrounded by Africa's most feared predators who had, somehow, chosen not to kill him, but to accept him. The cub had scurried to its mother's side. It nestled beneath her massive chest, letting out soft, rhythmic chirps as she groomed him lovingly. Frank watched, awestruck, as the pride gathered around the reunion. Their behavior not wild and violent, but tender, purposeful, ancient. He should have left then. That would have been the wise thing, the safe thing. But something deeper held him there, something older than logic. He had returned to this land to fulfill a promise. And now, inexplicably, he had more than just Eleanor's ashes in his possession. He had the attention of the rift itself. Frank stood slowly, boots sinking the wet soil, and took one cautious step back. He expected the pride to tighten around the cub or give a warning growl. Instead, they parted. The matriarch turned her great head toward him and blinked. Once, slowly, deliberately. The message was undeniable. Not yet. Stay. Then, to his utter disbelief, the entire pride shifted their formation, positioning themselves in two staggered lines. Lionesses on one side, the male on the other, creating a corridor between Frank and the acacia grove behind him where he had left Eleanor's urn beneath the twisted branches. He didn't know what to call it. Not an escort. Not a trap. It was the procession. A ceremonial path. Like something out of an old Maasai legend. Except he was living it. He took one step forward. The lions didn't move. Then another. Still, they stood tall, silent sentinels. Their golden eyes flicked back and forth, scanning the trees, not in warning, in watchfulness. They were guarding him. Frank couldn't speak. His throat was tight, his vision blurred, not from fear, but from a surreal, sacred enormity of the moment. Each step toward that tree was like crossing a bridge from one life to another. With every crunch of grass underfoot, he shed something. The guilt, the anger, the regret. The man who had arrived in Kenya to scatter his wife's ashes had died in that river. What walked forward now was someone else. When he reached the urn, he paused, placing a hand gently on its smooth wooden surface. The bark of the fever tree above creaked in the breeze, its leaves trembling like 1,000 green hands applauding in hushed reverence. Frank opened the urn. His fingers trembled, not from nerves, but reverence. "I brought you home, Ellie," he whispered. He looked back over his shoulder. The lions had formed a semicircle around him, their heads bowed low, their bodies still. Even the cub had gone silent. With a deep breath, Frank released the ashes into the African wind. They rose slowly, carried upward in a slow spiral, like smoke from an ancient fire. The wind caught them with gentleness, not ferocity. It was as if the rift itself had exhaled. The ashes danced into the canopy, over the pride, across the grassland, and disappeared. For a full minute, no one moved. Then, the matriarch let out a low, musical rumble, a sound that was neither roar nor growl, something softer, a lullaby for the land. The others joined in, not loud, not violent, just a chorus of breath and memory. Frank dropped to his knees again, overcome. He felt something break loose inside him, like a stone rolling off a long clenched heart. He wept openly, not for his wife. She was home now. Not for himself. He was free. He wept for the world, for the wild, for all the things we forget to feel when we surround ourselves with walls and wires and worry, for the sacred that still lives in teeth and claw and grace. Eventually, the wind died down. The lions sat in silent vigil. Frank stood slowly, nodding to them, unsure what to do next. That's when something happened that stopped his heart all over again. The cub, the very one he had just saved from death, trotted toward him, not cautiously, not nervously, but as a child would run toward a familiar uncle. It brushed against his leg. Once, twice, then sat down and looked up at him. Big, round eyes. Curious, trusting. Frank couldn't help it. He reached down, fingers trembling, and scratched behind the cub's tiny ear. The cub purred. Audibly. The matriarch didn't object. The male didn't growl. There was no fear. Only presence. Only now. Only respect. The wind picked up again, this time from the east, signaling the shift in the day. Clouds were beginning to gather near the escarpment. Afternoon storms were coming. Frank knew he had to go. He couldn't stay with the pride forever. This moment, perfect as it was, belonged to the rift. He had borrowed it, tasted it, lived it, but even borrowed time has a cost. He turned back toward the jeep, still a few hundred feet away beyond the thickets. He took one hesitant step, then another. That's when it hit him. He wasn't alone. They were coming with him. The lions formed around him again, this time tighter, more deliberate. The male on his left, the matriarch on his right, the others falling in step behind, like living shadows. And the cub, always the cub, walking beside him, brushing his legs with youthful insistence. It was more than a procession now. It was protection. It was an honor. It was goodbye. And yet it wasn't. They walked together to the tall golden grass, not predator and prey, not man and beast, but something older. The ground crunched beneath his boots. The cub mewed softly. The matriarch occasionally chuffed, a soft vocal signal used to comfort cubs. The male flicked his tail like a metronome, steady, unwavering. Each sound, each step, stitched Frank deeper into something ancient, not just survival, not just ceremony, belonging. When they reached the thicket's edge, the lion stopped. The matriarch stepped forward one last time. Frank turned to her and locked eyes, and she pressed her forehead gently against his once more. Not dominance, not farewell, but recognition. You are one of us. For today, for this moment. He placed a trembling hand on the bridge of her nose. Thank you, he said. Then, one by one, the lions came forward. A nose touch, a brush of the flank. Even a massive male gave a soft grunt and gently nudged Frank's arm before stepping away. Finally, the cub approached. It sat before Frank, tilted its tiny head, and gave a soft, high-pitched mew like a question. Frank smiled through tears, knelt, and gently stroked the cub's head. No more debts today, little one, he whispered. Then, with a final look, the pride turned and melted into the bush. Frank watched until the last tail vanished behind the acacia. And then silence, not emptiness, but completeness. He stood alone beside his gear, soaked, bruised, and blessed. Not because he had saved a cub, but because he had remembered what it meant to be human. Not civilized, not powerful, just connected to grief, to the wild, to something beyond words. He looked up at the sky as thunder rolled in the distance, and he whispered, "She saw that, didn't she?" The wind rustled through the fever trees, as if to say, yes, every second. The storm didn't come that night. It flirted with the horizon, thunder rolling like ancient drums beyond the distant hills, but it never crossed into Frank's piece of sky. It was as if the rift had made a silent agreement with the old ranger. You've had enough storms for one day. Frank sat beside the fire outside his tent, wrapped in a canvas jacket that still carried the scent of river mud and lion fur. The cub's mule, the matriarch's breath, the rumble of the male lion's chest, all of it played like a sacred reel in his mind. He hadn't touched his food. Couldn't. Instead, he just sat there with a mug of lukewarm tea, staring into the embers, trying to understand, trying not to, because some things aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be honored. And that's what he did. He sat in silence, honoring the moment, honoring Eleanor, honoring the wild. That night, he dreamed of lions, not chasing or roaring, but simply walking beside him through tall grass, always looking forward, always in step. And Eleanor was there too, smiling. By morning, news of his encounter had already begun to spread to the conservancy like wildfire. Word of mouth traveled faster through the bush than it ever could through satellites and cell towers. Frank didn't post about it, didn't film it. He didn't even plan to mention it. But someone else had. A local guide, Benji, had seen the entire procession from a ridge and recorded it on a drone he'd been testing. No sound, just visuals. But it was enough. Enough to shake foundations. Enough to stir questions. Enough to call people from far and wide who needed to know how. That afternoon, a conservancy vehicle pulled up, and out stepped a woman Frank hadn't seen in over 40 years. "Still getting yourself into trouble, Delaney?" she said, removing her sunglasses with a smirk. Frank squinted, heart skipping. Sarah? Dr. Sarah Mbeki, now head of behavioral ecology at the University of Cape Town. Back in the day, she had been a young intern working under Frank, sharp as a blade, full of idealism and caffeine. Now, her hair had streaks of silver, and her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had spent her life decoding the language of the wild. "I saw the drone footage," she said. "I came straight here." Frank chuckled, though his throat was dry. "I didn't do anything special. Just pulled a cub out of the water." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You pulled a lion cub from a flooding river in front of its pride, and they escorted you like royalty. That's not nothing special. That's the behavior of something bigger. Much bigger." She sat with Frank beneath the same tree where he had scattered Eleanor's ashes. The wind was softer that day, like a lullaby. Sarah explained that the pride's actions, the grooming, the procession, the forehead touch, were not only unprecedented but scientifically unfathomable. No known record in the last 100 years had documented such interspecies interaction. Lions didn't behave that way. Not in the wild. This isn't instinct, she said. This is cognition, memory, possibly gratitude, possibly morality. Frank didn't need the scientific language. He just nodded. I know what I felt, Sarah, he said quietly. They saw me, not as a threat, not as prey, but as someone. She leaned in. We've always assumed animals can't comprehend intent. But what if they can? What if that lioness didn't just recognize you save her cub? What if she understood why you did it? Frank exhaled slowly. Then maybe she forgave more than just the present. That night, Sarah set up a field camera at the edge of camp, just in case. The pride didn't return that night, but something else did. Just after midnight, Frank was woken by the sound of soft paws on gravel. No growls, no roars, just movement. He stepped outside with nothing but his breath and a flashlight. And there, sitting calmly in the moonlight, was the cub, alone, watching him. Frank didn't move. The cub didn't approach. They just looked at each other. Minutes passed. The cub stood, stretched, and with a flick of its tail, padded back into the bush. Frank smiled. They remember, he whispered. Over the next 3 days, the pride appeared 3 more times. Never threatening, never aggressive. Sometimes they watched from a distance. Sometimes they lay near Frank's vehicle, using it for shade. Other times, the cub would sneak closer than the rest, plop down like a tired puppy, and nap within a few yards of him. Sarah filmed everything. When she submitted the footage to the African Wildlife Council, it caused a stir unlike anything the Conservancy had seen in years. Ethologists, biologists, journalists, spiritual leaders, everyone wanted to weigh in. The footage aired on local and international news. And suddenly, Frank Delaney, retired ranger, widower, man who hadn't used email in 15 years, became the center of a global conversation. He was offered interviews. He declined. He was offered money. He refused. He was offered books, podcasts, documentaries. He considered, but only on one condition. They have to understand, he told Sarah. This ain't about me. This is about them. Sarah agreed. Together, they formed the Thompson-Marr Trust, named after Eleanor's family name and the place of the encounter, to study emotional intelligence in apex predators, and to preserve that land as a place of peace and observation, not tourism and exploitation. A few weeks later, something unexpected arrived at the Trust's doorstep, a handwritten letter from none other than Dr. Jane Goodall. It read, "What you witnessed may be one of the most significant interspecies moments of the century. You reminded us that humility and compassion are not just human values. They are universal truths waiting to be recognized in the eyes of the wild." Frank cried when he read it. Then he framed it and hung it inside the research tent. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and the sky turned the color of blood and honey, Frank sat once more beneath the fever tree. He held a weathered notebook in his lap and began to write, not for the public, not for science, but for the cub. He didn't know why. He just felt it was right. He wrote about the first time he saw Africa, about Eleanor, about the lion he couldn't save, about the one he did. And as he finished the last line, he looked up and saw the cub again, sitting at a distance, watching. Frank nodded. "You're going to be king someday," he said softly, "and I reckon you'll remember." It had been 3 months since Frank Delaney had returned to Kenya to scatter his wife's ashes. 3 months since he stepped into a flood-swollen river and pulled a lion cub from death. 3 months since he'd stood soaked and trembling at the center of a lion pride that chose mercy over murder. And yet, every morning since, he woke as if it had just happened. The land never let him forget. Not the whisper of wind to the fevered trees, not the shape of paw prints etched into the dried riverbed, not the tiny tufts of golden fur snagged on thorny brush near his tent. Even now, in the dry season, when the grass is yellowed and the sky is cracked with heat, the rift seemed to hum with the memory of that sacred moment. Frank had grown thinner, his face more angular, his voice raspier, but his presence it carried weight. People came now, scientists, students, Poets, journalists, not to hear some grand speech or witness tricks, but just to see the place, to stand where it happened, to sit where a pride of lions bowed their heads to a man they didn't have to spare. And quietly, the place became a pilgrimage. One morning, as the sun rose with that soft Kenyan blaze, gentle, not yet cruel, Frank stepped out of his tent and saw them. The pride. Again, after nearly a month without contact, they stood at the edge of the open plain, just far enough to keep their mystery, just close enough to prove they remembered. The matriarch stood tall. Her cub, now bigger, leaner, stronger, stood beside her. The same cub, Frank's cub. No, not his. He had only borrowed him from the wild for a few desperate minutes. But still they were bound. Forever. Frank walked out into the field, slow, measured, the way one would approach a ghost they weren't sure would stay. He didn't go all the way to them. He didn't have to. The cub, now a yearling, broke from the pride and trotted toward him. No hesitation. No fear. Frank stood still, heart pounding with the gravity of it all. The cub came within 3 feet, sat down and waited. Frank knelt. They locked eyes. And for a few perfect seconds, man and lion sat in silence. Not a single camera. Not a single word. Just two beings who knew what it meant to fight the current and come back alive. Later that week, Frank found himself seated beneath the acacia again, flipping through an old journal that Eleanor had started years ago. She had written a passage he hadn't seen before. It was folded between the pages, scribbled in pencil on hotel stationery. If you ever go back to the Mara, I hope something wild finds you, not to hurt you, but to remind you who you were before the world softened you. Frank smiled as tears slipped down his cheeks. That's exactly what happened. He hadn't just come back to say goodbye. He had come back to remember, to become again. But life had a way of circling back, didn't it? Because just when Frank thought the chapter was closing, the rift handed him a new page. One morning, Benji, the local guide who had filmed the original drone footage, rushed into camp. "Mr. Frank," he said, breathless, "there's something you should see. It's your cub." Frank's heart skipped. The young lion had been found snared in a steel trap set by illegal poachers in the northern quadrant of the reserve. Out of bounds. Out of law. He was wounded but alive. Rangers were already on their way to sedate and rescue him. Frank didn't hesitate. He insisted on going. Sarah tried to stop him. "You're not a ranger anymore. You're not 30. You're not even 60. Frank looked her dead in the eyes. "I've got debts that don't care about age." They drove for nearly 2 hours through harsh terrain, the sun unforgiving. The earth cracked like old leather. When they arrived, Frank could see the cub sprawled, panting, his paw caught in the wicked iron teeth of the snare. Even wounded, the young lion snarled at the approaching humans, protective, panicked, until Frank stepped forward. He walked slowly, speaking in a low, gravelly whisper, the same tone he used when Eleanor had trouble sleeping, the same tone he used in the river that day. The cub stopped thrashing. Frank knelt beside him. "I'm here again, little prince," he whispered. "I got you." The tranquilizer took hold quickly after that. The snare was removed. And once again, a life was returned to wild because Frank Delaney had shown up that night after the cub was treated and safely returned his pride. Frank sat alone, bruised and sore and impossibly full. He realized something. He hadn't saved the cub. Not really. The cub had saved him. Time and again. Pulled him back from numbness. Dragged him out of grief. Lifted him from guilt. That lion didn't need a man. But the man? He needed a lion. A few weeks later, Sarah approached Frank with a proposal. "We want to name him." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Name who?" "The cub. Officially. For the research database." Frank nodded slowly. "He's your subject now." Sarah smiled. "No, he's your legacy." They waited for him to speak. Frank stared out across the plain with a pride lounged in the shade. "Name him. Echo," he said. "Why Echo?" Frank smiled, eyes glistening. "Because every time he roars, I want the world to remember what love, mercy, and second chances sound like." News spread. The story of Echo and the ranger who had saved him twice began to echo itself through newspapers, online forums, podcasts. Tourists came, but they were warned. No interaction. No selfies. No feeding. The trust was sacred ground. And still, people came. Not to see Echo. To feel what Frank had felt. Even if only for a moment. The last time Frank saw the pride, it was a morning like any other. Clear skies. Calm wind. Birds calling lazily. But the moment, it was different. The pride was gathered near a hilltop overlooking the savannah. Frank approached, slow and steady. No camera, no fanfare, just presence. Echo met him halfway. They sat again, just like before. But this time, Echo was larger, stronger. His mane had begun to darken around the edges. A king in the making. Frank didn't speak. He just reached out, touched Echo's mane, and whispered a silent goodbye. As he stood to leave, Echo did something no one would ever believe if it hadn't been captured on Sarah's hidden field camera. He followed Frank all the way back to the camp, and as Frank stepped inside his tent, Echo sat at the threshold, watching, guarding. Frank died in his sleep that night, peacefully. No struggle, just stillness. He was found with Eleanor's journal clutched to his chest and a small lion carving in his hand, a gift from a local child a day after he saved Echo the second time. Outside, Echo waited until sunrise. Then, without sound, he stood and returned to the wild. They buried Frank under the fever tree. No headstone, just a small plaque that read, "He remembered." So the wild remembered him. And every few weeks, without fail, Echo returns. He doesn't stay long, just long enough. A glance, a breath, an echo of the man who reminded the world that the wild does not forget.